There are 1,001 reasons why I should hate Final Fantasy VIII, why I shouldn't even waste my time defending it, because I know, not even deep down, I can freely admit that this game is a disaster. The story is nonsense, the difficulty balance is some of the worst in the genre, and the junctioning system serves as just this thin veneer of complexity. The customization options are more shallow than the game lets on. By all reasonable metrics, Final Fantasy VIII is not a good game. But here's why I'm a hypocrite, because despite admitting that Final Fantasy VIII isn't good, it was my favorite game at one point, and I still really like it. Everyone's got a guilty pleasure, and more than anything, I'm making this video to help myself better understand what the lasting allure is here. At first, I thought my lingering appreciation for this game could be attributed to nostalgia. It was the first Final Fantasy I bought with my own money, but in revisiting the game some 20 years after my first playthrough, I realized that nostalgia plays no role here. In fact, and I'm not speaking for everyone, this is just a personal anecdote, turns out I have zero nostalgia for media. When I look at a game from my childhood like Snowboard Kids, I'm filled with fond memories, but I don't think, man, remember Snowboard Kids? That was a great game. Instead, I remember looking through the Nintendo 64 section at Blockbuster after school on a Friday night, getting home, sitting down on a foam puzzle piece and playing with my brothers. I'm reminded of a simpler time, when I didn't need to wake up at 6 AM to drive to work. And when I look at other games like Bomberman Hero and Chameleon Twist, I feel the same way, which tells me that it's not really the games that I care about, it's the time in my life that I'm nostalgic for. When I booted these games up for the first time in over 2 decades to make this video, I realized that they're not that great. It's not because they aged poorly. I don't think there's such a thing as games aging poorly. Good game design will always be good. Look at Tetris, still holding up after 40 years. Look at Mario 64, released before both Bomberman Hero and Chameleon Twist, and people still praise it. Nobody's singing praises for Bomberman Hero. No, the reason why I liked these games as a kid is because I had low standards. If I saw a colorful cartoon character jumping around, I had a good time. I didn't pull out a magnifying glass and go, you know, the level design here doesn't make much sense. I was able to enjoy most games I played because, at that point in my life, I hadn't played hundreds of games. Now when I replay these older games, I have a better perspective on what makes for a good platformer. These games didn't age poorly, I just finally realized what elements make for an engaging experience. If I was an adult in the late 90s, I would have never thought these games were good. What's interesting to me is that my line of reasoning should apply towards Final Fantasy VIII. The only reason I liked it so much when I was younger was because I didn't play 100 better RPGs. Except, when I replayed the game for this video, that thought never crossed my mind. Instead, I was surprised at how unique Final Fantasy VIII remains to this day. The series never tried to replicate the ideas used in this game, probably because most of the ideas were poorly implemented. Yet these poorly implemented ideas lend a unique flavor to the game, and as someone that values games that try to be different, I can't help but love how utterly broken this game is. I love it precisely because it's terrible. I shouldn't, but just this once, I've got to be a hypocrite and completely ruin any credibility I might have, because Final Fantasy VIII is a damn good time. You probably noticed that I'm not playing the remastered version, and I hate to beat a dead horse, but modern Square Enix is incompetent. For whatever reason, whenever Square ports a game, they make an effort to port the worst version possible. With Final Fantasy VIII, the remastered version is based on the 2013 Steam release, which itself was based on the original PC release, which didn't support free movement with the analog stick, just 8-way movement because you played with a keyboard. It also didn't have vibration support, so the feedback from Squall's attacks are missing. The textures are also worse than the original PS1 version. Not only that, the PS1 version had the menus running at 60 frames per second. This is relevant because the limit breaks require precise timing. The remastered version's menus run at 30 frames per second. The updated character models clash horribly with the pre-rendered environments. The new font lacks the chunky boldness of the original. Worthless ports no longer surprise me, and if Square didn't care enough to put forth an ounce of effort, I wasn't going to spend a penny buying this game again. When you look at the series as a whole and try to determine which games were most influential in shaping future entries, people tend to gloss over Final Fantasy VIII in favor of Final Fantasy VII, because Final Fantasy VII came first. It made such a large impact on global audiences that JRPGs and probably Japanese games as a whole would not have the worldwide appeal they have today if Final Fantasy VII didn't get millions of people's foots in the door. Translations for Japanese games released before Final Fantasy VII were heavily localized, to the point where they could basically be considered fanfiction. One of the most notorious companies guilty of this practice was Working Designs, who didn't care to write accurate translations for their releases. They rewrote their published games to appeal to Western audiences, which made sense. If you compare the popularity of Japanese culture these days to the 90s, it's not even a contest. What's most interesting about this is that localization continues to be a contentious subject 30 years later. Back then, your average player didn't care, because you didn't have hordes of fans fluent in both Japanese and English posting comparison pictures on the internet. When we look at these games in retrospect, we can see just how much was lost in translation. But when we played these games as kids and teenagers, we didn't know how much was changed, and we didn't care. Maybe I'm an outlier here, but I don't make a big deal out of localization changes because I grew up playing all of these heavily altered games, and I love them. Now that I know that these English scripts don't resemble the originals in Japanese, I'm not gonna suddenly turn on the games and pretend that I didn't enjoy them. So long as I'm enjoying what I'm reading, that's what matters. If I wanted to experience the unaltered source material, I'd put in the effort to learn Japanese instead of waiting a year for localization. The fact that I don't understand a lick of Japanese should sum up my thoughts on this matter. But as influential as Final Fantasy VII was for popularizing JRPGs, Final Fantasy VIII marked the largest departure the series had experienced up to that point. The first 6 Final Fantasies were predominantly medieval fantasy stories with light sci-fi elements sprinkled in, like airships and mechs. Final Fantasy VII tried to modernize the setting by leaning deeper into the science fiction aspect. It included modern weaponry and vehicles, and a powerful corporation that runs the largest city on the planet. But you still had distinctive fantasy characters like a talking dog, a vampire, a young ninja apprentice. The game didn't commit to full-blown sci-fi, it was still very much a Final Fantasy game. Final Fantasy VIII doesn't shed its fantasy roots entirely, but it was the first serious attempt in crafting a modern sci-fi hybrid for the series. Everything from the character models, to the dialogue, to pop culture elements was deliberately designed to re-theme the game and give it a distinct modern feel. Characters finally appear humanoid. They speak in more natural and believable ways, even interrupting and speaking over one another. And don't forget, this was released in the late 90s when Magic the Gathering and Yu-Gi-Oh! And Pokemon cards were all the rage in elementary school cafeterias. So of course the minigame is going to resemble that addictive gotta collect all the rare cards nature of real-life card games. And for older fans of the series, they weren't really on board with this new approach. To them, Final Fantasy is a medieval series about collecting crystals and saving the world, not driving your hovering military camp into the ocean and chasing your girlfriend into outer space. I can understand not being on board with these changes, and to an extent, I think even Square regrets the futuristic direction they steered the series in. Final Fantasy IX through 12 reined in the modern and future elements and grounded the series back in the world of fantasy with just a sprinkling of sci-fi, leaving Final Fantasy VIII as an outlier for many years. It's easy to forget about this game's history when you look at modern Final Fantasy games. I've played this game more than a half dozen times, I lost count, and even I forgot just how unique it is. That uniqueness is a large part of its appeal. I give games more credit than I really should if they stand apart from the crowd. I value creativity and innovation, even if those changes aren't always successful, because they create experiences that you can't get elsewhere. I can play a dozen turn-based RPGs with better combat mechanics, but the charm and feel of Final Fantasy VIII is one of a kind. The first series tradition that's broken happens almost immediately. You can name Squall whatever you like, but you can't rename Quistis. Keep in mind, there's no voice acting. When the series started incorporating voice acting in Final Fantasy X, not being able to rename all of your party members made sense. doesn't make much sense in this unvoiced era. Final Fantasy IX reversed this change and allowed you to rename everyone. Again, I think Square had some regret with the changes they made in Final Fantasy VIII and tried to course correct with the sequels. And unlike Final Fantasy VII's explosive intro with the bombing a Mako reactor, Final Fantasy VIII opens with a much slower pace, bogging you down with tutorials for longer than it needs to. You bump into Selphie and the game presents you with an option to give her a tour around the school. This is a smart way of incorporating a tutorial. Squall is already a student here, so we should already know where everything is, but because the player doesn't, he's put in a situation where he can teach the player how to navigate the garden in an organic way. If you've already played the game, or you just don't care to tour the school, you can ignore Selphie and skip the tutorial, but you can't skip the numerous junctioning tutorials. It'd make more sense for Quistis to ask Squall if he needs a refresher on junctioning so you can skip the tutorial, much in the same way you can skip the school tour. It gets silly once you've already left the country to fight in a war, and when you return to celebrate your graduation ceremony, Quistis pulls you away from the party to force another tutorial on you. Before you go to war, you've got to complete your preliminary exam, aka the tutorial dungeon. Once you reach the fire cavern, you're given 4 options to choose from to serve as your time limit. This might not make much sense at this point, but your actions in this beginning portion of the game are being graded. The game keeps track of your performance to assign you a seed rank, and your rank determines your salary. After a fixed number of steps, you'll receive your pay depending on your rank. Every time you're paid, an invisible count is subtracted from your grade, and after a certain amount of pay periods, your rank will drop. In essence, this just means if you fight battles regularly, your rank will stay consistent or rise, and if you're not fighting enough battles, the rank will drop. As far as the fire cavern goes, the goal here is to kill Ifrit with the timer as close to 0 seconds remaining as possible, something that's easier to achieve if you choose the shortest time limit. You can also game the system by waiting out the clock on the screen where you name Ifrit. Once you commence your mission in Dalit, you're scored based on how long you take, how many enemies you kill, if you kill the spider boss, and if you follow orders, listening to Cypher's orders and not wasting time talking to people. All of these actions will influence your starting rank. Money is usually easy to come by in this series, so it's refreshing to see the approach change with this game. The rank system is integrated well with your role in the story, and even if it's easily abused by boosting your rank from tests you can take in the classroom, being rewarded based on your performance is a great way to immerse players in this world. You're a military student, so you should be acting in a disciplined manner, but instead of forcing you to act this way, you're given a choice. The difference between role-playing and just watching a story play out is having the freedom to make choices, however small they may be. This rank system is a subtle way to reward diligent players, and it's not designed to be punishing to players that don't understand it. During your fight with Ifrit, you'll come to realize that spamming regular attacks is the most efficient way to win. Unfortunately, this is a tactic that doesn't change throughout the entire game. Summons and magic exist to strengthen your melee attacks. You can summon and cast magic in battle, but these options are not only inefficient, they're wasteful. Let's start with summons. When you summon, you enter a channeling state where your GF's health bar takes the place of your own. Useful if you want to absorb damage, but you also lock your character's actions until the summoning is complete. This is time that could be spent squeezing in more damage or reacting to an attack. Once the summon goes off, you're forced to watch its lengthy animation play out, and after 1 or 2 summons you'll probably grow sick of watching them. The reason they last so long is because you can unlock the boost ability for GFs, where you play a button mashing minigame to increase their damage output as you wait for the animation to finish. But if you don't want to boost, or if you summon a GF before unlocking their boost ability, it doesn't make sense to force the player to watch these animations every time. Magic is integrated in an interesting way. Magic exists as consumable items, and they can stack up to 100 times per spell for each character. You can obtain magic by drawing them off enemies, examining draw points on the map, and transforming items into spells. Having multiple methods of acquiring magic would be great if the system was balanced. Instead, refining items into spells is so much faster and easier than either of the other methods that you can wind up destroying the difficulty during this beginning portion of the game without any effort. Why sit and draw from monsters for hours when you can refine a card into an item and then turn those items into full stacks of magic for each character? And each character has an invisible gauge called a crisis level. As your HP drops to critical and party members faint, your crisis level rises, and once it reaches the minimum threshold, a limit break will become active for your character. The higher the crisis level, the more powerful the limit break. This should make for an interesting mechanic. Play at low HP the entire time to gain access to your most powerful attacks, but also have a perpetual risk of dying. But remember, this game is broken, and it's broken because of level scaling. Bosses don't give experience points, but random enemies do, and every time a character hits 1000 experience points, they level up. And as your average party level rises, the enemies and bosses in the world will level up as well. It's a system designed to keep the difficulty steady throughout the entire experience, but it doesn't work. Instead, if you know what you're doing, level scaling completely breaks the balance. Let's break this down. Bosses don't give experience, so if you ignore every single random encounter in the game, you will always be able to fight the easiest possible version of each boss because you won't be leveling up. And because junctioning is isolated from the leveling system, you can still boost your character stats while the bosses remain at their lowest possible difficulty level. In other words, you're leveling up without leveling up. All of this ties into junctioning, which is the primary culprit here. For all the tutorials the game forces on you, the only thing you need to consider in this game is stocking the most powerful magic you can get your hands on, equipping them to the most beneficial stats like strength and HP, and never casting magic in battle so your stats remain at their highest possible level. Don't summon GFs, don't cast magic, don't heal party members, just stay in critical HP and refresh your command menu until limits appear. To make things easier, you get a summon early on that teaches you the Encounter None ability, so you don't even need to run from random encounters. You won't get any at all. This isn't something that's difficult to figure out. The game gives you all these tools at the beginning of the game, and because it's so easy to get broken so fast, I can only assume this was a deliberate design choice. The approach when balancing Final Fantasy VIII was to let the player dictate how easy or hard he wants the game to be. If you want to play it like a traditional Final Fantasy using magic and summons, you can, but you're not really incentivized to do so. In Square's quest to make this game different from its predecessors, they incorporated so many new and reworked features that they didn't know how to balance them, so they implemented some half-hearted level scaling in hopes that the enemies would keep up with the player. But the less you interact with the game, the more powerful you become. As a result, Square accidentally created one of the most interesting disasters in their entire catalog. Never before had I seen an RPG where the less you care about using the full breadth of your moveset, the easier the game becomes. The game breaks typical RPG conventions by allowing you to boost your characters early on without much effort or grinding, and there's something alluring about seeing quadruple digit health just a few hours into the game. Junctioning is broken, sure, but it's so broken that it puts Final Fantasy VIII in an interesting position. Square inadvertently made a game ripe for speedrunning, or at the very least they made the game easy to replay. There's no need to grind, and you can skip enemies and raise your stats with minimal effort, which makes the game flow smoothly from start to finish. Once you finish this early game segment, you can cruise through the rest of the game with ease, enjoying the dungeons, boss fights, and set pieces without mindlessly slaughtering thousands of random mobs just to keep up with levels. And considering this is a turn-based game, you wind up shaving hours off the experience, hours that wouldn't have consisted of compelling gameplay anyway. If you take away junctioning, what you're left with is an otherwise straightforward game from a genre overflowing with straightforward games. Despite the modern setting, you're still just lining up your party members and smacking monsters with swords and fists, casting magic and using summons. In terms of combat, it's not much different from the Super Nintendo era of Final Fantasies. Nothing wrong with that, but I can't help but feel like if Final Fantasy VIII were balanced properly, the combat would be much less interesting. After you beat Ifrit, Quistis stops you for another tutorial as you stand inches away from a sea of lava. This couldn't wait until we left. As we'll see later, Quistis has a habit of dragging you out into the middle of nowhere to give you private lessons. Her character is pretty endearing. She really likes Squall without outright admitting it. It's too bad her character arc begins and ends there. Most of the main party gets shafted in terms of character development in this game. If the character isn't on the box art, they really don't exhibit much depth. Speedrunners use this opportunity to kill these fish and grab 5 fish fins, which you can refine into 100 waters, junction to strength, and hit cruise control for the next 2 hours. And you can grab some powerful triple triad cards right now like the Quistis card, which can be used to steamroll the rest of the players in the garden, but I've had more than my fill of triple triad throughout the years. I'm just holding on to it until I can refine it into an endgame level spell that sends your attack stat into the stratosphere. You're told to change into your combat uniform. There's some nice attention to detail in Squall's room. His gunblade comes in something that resembles a guitar case, and considering Cypher also has a gunblade, I'm curious if there are different brands of gunblades like Gibson and Fender, and once Squall changes his outfit, you can see him hang his usual jacket on the wall. Your graduation exam takes place in Dalit, which is the portion of the game shown off in the demo. If you were around back then, you probably remember that Pizza Hut gave out PlayStation demo discs. There are plenty of differences between what was shown off in the demo and what wound up being part of the full release, but the most noteworthy difference is that the music that played during this segment was changed. I couldn't find any official reasoning, but the popular assumption is that the demo song was too similar to the theme from The Rock, that Sean Connery movie, so it was replaced with a different track. I prefer the track used in the full game, so as far as I'm concerned, I'm glad it was changed. You're still in a glorified tutorial at this point, so it's amusing that you fight 3 bosses in a row here. None of them are challenging, especially when Squall's limit break destroys everything, but what's important to note is that you can draw the GF Siren from this boss. Several GFs need to be drawn from bosses, and if you miss them, you get one last chance in the final dungeon, but by then you won't get much use out of them, and some are completely missable, like Gilgamesh. Missables were great during this era of JRPGs because you'd pick up a strategy guide while browsing the game section at Toys R Us and realize you missed out on half the game. A feeling that you can't really get these days. The internet and searchable wikis made guides obsolete. Now they're just a collector's stomping ground. But there are a number of little missables in Final Fantasy VIII. Some are just flavor text, but the GFs are certainly the most notable ones. Siren's an important one to grab since she comes with the ability to refine cure spells from healing items, which you can junction to HP to see your health bar skyrocket. But before you can quadruple your health, you need to escape Dalit, and the spider tank boss will chase you through the streets. You can kill it, which influences your starting seed rank, but it's more fun trying to evade the boss. Plus you get this iconic FMV if you let it chase you to the shore. When you return to Balam, you can challenge Zell's mother to Triple Triad to try and win her son's card off her. I find it strange how people can just make cards of themselves, make them the strongest cards in the game, and they're considered legal. I guess it's fair since they need to be surrendered if you lose, and it took me almost an hour for Zell's mom to finally play the card. Here's a bit of foreshadowing. This garden staff member tells you to ignore GF criticism you hear from others, which plays into the Orphanage plot twist, and even though this is technically foreshadowing, you're not gonna predict this twist on a first playthrough. Actually, that's an understatement. Even a congregation of fortune tellers that somehow found a time-traveling DeLorean wouldn't be able to predict this twist. But if you replay the game, it's nice to pick up on these little hints. As you head back to the classroom, you get this gem of a scene where Cypher slow claps for your team. I love how you can tell the personality of each character in this room without anyone saying a word. When you're dealing with a visual medium, scenes like this are more memorable than characters standing around chatting. Same deal with the dance scene. It's remarkable how Square was able to show so much personality from these characters back in the PS1 era, all without a lick of voice acting or even a single line of dialogue. Keep in mind this released just 2 years after Final Fantasy VII, yet the visual improvements speak for themselves. For anyone that says graphics don't matter in games, hopefully this illustrates just how much better the game is able to communicate a character's emotion from animations and facial expressions alone. After the celebration, you're given a magic lamp, which pits you against the most important GF in the game. The trick here is to cast blind, making it impossible for Diablos to kill you. But I forgot to junction it, and it wound up not being an issue because a few limit breaks make short work of him. Diablos is important to grab early on, not just because he lets you bypass random encounters, but because he comes with Time Magic Refine, which lets us craft some endgame level spells. Before boarding the train to continue the story, you can waltz into the Balam Hotel and read a magazine. For some reason, reading this changes the scene in the upcoming flashback. Laguna will pass out on Julia's bed from drinking too much wine. It's something that's easy to miss and it doesn't affect the story, but it's always nice to learn new things about a game when you replay it. The game so far has been pretty linear when compared to prior entries in the series, and that's not going to change for the remainder of Disc 1. In fact, it's not until you're over halfway through Disc 2 when you'll finally gain the freedom to traverse the world. As someone that prefers linear experiences, this portion of the game is one of the highlights. You've got a clear mission laid out, and you can't freely travel the globe picking up side quests, so you never get the sensation that you're wandering around wasting time. That said, even though the story's been straightforward up to this point, it falls apart the moment you load up Disc 2. But that's not for a while. First, Rinoa and her team explain why they hired you. They need your help kidnapping the president of Galbadia. I know I said the story falls apart in Disc 2, but you get a taste of just how bad it can get right now. Rinoa's group receives intel that the president will be traveling by train, and she figures that the best opportunity to kidnap him would be during this train ride. And just so we're clear, there are only 2 guards on this train. Instead of storming the train and knocking out the pair of guards, Rinoa decides to hire a mercenary group, hire a president lookalike, obtain 2 train cars, get interior pictures of the president's train so she can perfectly redesign the dummy car to match it, and put everyone's lives at risk by running atop these high-speed trains to switch the president's train with a dummy that has their lookalike. In addition, the Owls create a model to simulate how this is gonna play out, and Rinoa somehow obtains security codes to decouple the cars while they're moving. So clearly they spent weeks running simulations and gathering information from all these contacts instead of just, tailing the president's limousine and running him off the road. It's such an absurd plan that has no reason to exist aside from the fact that it makes for a fun mission. Which is all that really matters at the end of the day, but still, if Rinoa wanted to approach this in a practical way, almost anything would beat this train heist. I get that she wants the kidnapping to be discreet, but can't your spies find out where the president eats dinner? You can have one of your guys pose as a waiter to poison his meal, then grab him when he runs to the bathroom. Sure, that wouldn't be an action-packed mission, but it's more believable than this fear factor stunt. But the worst part is that the president planned all of this out. He gave fake information to the Owls, hired a body double, and expected the Owls to stage the train kidnapping. In a way, this game plays like a summer blockbuster in that it becomes more enjoyable if you turn your brain off and try to enjoy the action. If you want to make sense of any of this, you're just gonna waste your time. And do you know why that is? It's because the writer, Nojima, has never, not a single time in his almost 40-year career as a professional writer, ever penned a story that wasn't a total disaster. The only thing he knows how to do is write twists. In his mind, if he can surprise the player, that makes for good storytelling. Doesn't matter how contrived the twist is, so long as he subverts expectations. He is a one-trick pony, and he's not even good at the singular trick he employs. Anyway, this is one of those undead bosses you can kill with healing items, but that's no fun. It's been years since I fought him properly, and it's not like anything stands a chance against non-stop limit breaks. So this mission didn't accomplish anything, but you learn that the communications tower in Dalit is the only one in the world capable of broadcasting radio, and it's been out of commission for 17 years. Instead of Dalit fixing it, the Galbadian army has to wage war and invade just to get it running again. I guess offering to fix the tower for free was out of the question. Better to start a war and fix it by force. And they do this so the president can hold a press conference in an enormous TV station that's glowing with searchlights, a building that hasn't been operational for 17 years, yet is still being powered on and maintained. And during this broadcast, Cypher single-handedly accomplishes what 3 resistance members and 3 mercenaries couldn't. He overthrows a handful of guards and holds the president hostage. The crew is pissed that Cypher showed them up, so they corner him into a room where Edea appears, who belittles Cypher and asks him to be her bodyguard. And he joins her, probably because he's still pissed at not being promoted to Seed and is looking for a meaning in life. But it doesn't make much sense to follow a mysterious sorceress into a portal without even knowing what it is she wants from you, or where the hell you're going. After leaving Timber, you enter the second Laguna flashback. This dungeon is pretty interesting because your actions here influence both the past and future. It affects the number of enemies you have to fight during the flashback, and it affects the items you can obtain when you revisit this area in Disc 3. There aren't many dungeons in this game, and a good chunk of them are optional, which is a shame because there are hints of great level design sprinkled here and there, and when the developers decided to give it their all for the final dungeon, they wound up creating one of the best dungeons in the series. In the meantime, we've got smaller areas like the Tomb of the Unknown King. The game directs you towards this dungeon to grab a code, but you can guess the code in one of 2 ways. The first is to count these poles in the background during the train ride to Delling City. They come in waves, and if you punch these numbers into a program, it'll spit out a handful of possible codes. If you pay attention to the behaviors of the NPCs that roam around Delling City, you can narrow down the code. I'm not a fan of this method. Speedrunners use this strategy, but I hate relying on external resources to cheat the game. So I use the second method. If you save and reload the game just before boarding the train, you can force the code to be 052. Sure, it means skipping out on a fun little dungeon with an entertaining boss hidden inside, but hey, we're on a mission from God, and there's no time for side quests. And before tackling the bosses that end Disc 1, we can see just how powerful you can get by running from most encounters and just refining a few cards and items. Triple is an endgame spell, and you can get your hands on 180 of them by turning the Quistis card into some items, then turning those items into triples. The Ifrit card lets you teach any GF the strength plus 60% ability, and with that, the game is over. You can one-shot this boss that attacks Renoa, you can one-shot Cypher, then Edea goes down in 4 hits. In reality it's 3, but I had Renoa attack without any triples junction just to show how big the damage difference is. But let's back it up a bit. There's some political tension boiling over, and the Gardens decide to join together to assassinate the sorceress. Even though Edea has only been the president's peace ambassador for a few days, the leaders of the Gardens determine that she's too intimidating and will help Galbadia take over the world, so she needs to die. They don't even want to try any other approach, just go straight to the assassination mission. And despite being conceived by the Gardens, who control hundreds of special ops mercenaries all over the globe, they decide that this is going to be a covert operation run by a handful of newbies and an ex-teacher. You split up into 2 teams for this mission, and this is something the game excels at. Typically in JRPGs with large parties, you settle on your favorite 3 or 4 characters and use them exclusively. Here, there are a number of times when your party splits up, forcing you to make use of each party member throughout the entire game. And thanks to the handy menu options that let you transfer GFs and magic wholesale, you don't even need to spend a lot of time micromanaging everyone. Squall and Irvin make up the strike team in charge of killing the sorceress, and the rest of the party belongs to the gate team. The plan is to trap Edea's parade float between 2 gates, then have Irvin blow her head off. The trap is a contingency plan in case Irvin fails, but by trapping Edea, they put her on alert, which causes her to see Irvin's shot coming. It'd make more sense to snipe her first, then raise the gates if he misses so they can catch her by surprise. But what would make more sense is if Irvin didn't accept this mission at all. He chokes up when the time comes to pull the trigger because the sorceress is also the woman that raised him. She raised everyone in your party except Renoa, but we'll get to that later. And he doesn't say a word about this to anyone. This is sabotage, and Irvin wasted everyone's time by not speaking up. So the party rushes the float, and Edea hurls an ice shard through Squall's chest, ending Disc 1. And I'm gonna completely skip over the next Laguna flashback, partly because nothing happens. Alone is introduced, but we'll cover her later. But also because I need to address the aftermath of this failed assassination. Disc 2 may be a third of the way through the game, and the story is already utter nonsense. Squall survived being blasted by a spear of ice, and even though having his face grazed by a sword was enough to send him to the infirmary and leave him with a scar, this attack did nothing. No pain, no scar. He survived, but the game never elaborates. Sure, the spear didn't go through his heart, but it could have pierced his lung. At the very least, he'd be hemorrhaging enough blood to die within a few minutes. He certainly wouldn't be swinging his sword around anytime soon. Point is, this isn't some minor injury you can just shrug off. But you can always rely on fans to try and make sense of poorly explained plot points. There's a website called Squall's Dead that's been online for many years, and it tries to recontextualize the story from Disc 2 onwards, by claiming that this is just Squall's life flashing before his eyes. I want to bring up 2 points regarding this theory. 1, I would never credit Nojima with the ability to write a multi-layered story. He doesn't understand subtlety. The fact that Laguna is Squall's father isn't even hinted at. You're beaten over the head. These Moombas won't stop calling him Laguna. And 2, the director of this game, Kitase, debunked this theory in an interview. So there you go, a fan theory attempting to make sense of the events that happen in this game was officially dismissed 20 years after the game's release, because the director has a fragile ego and doesn't want people to interpret his game in ways he disagrees with. Which means we can accept that everything that happens from this point onward is nonsense by design. And what kind of director debunks fan theories, especially decades later? Where do you stand to benefit by saying fans aren't interpreting the story correctly? Squall is miraculously healed, and you're not supposed to question this. But I have to question this. What reason is there to interrogate Squall instead of Quistis? Cypher knows that Squall has only been part of Seed for a few days. Why not question Quistis instead, who's been a Seed for 3 years and an instructor for 1? If there's anyone you want to probe for info, electrocute Quistis and leave Squall for dead. Cypher flips a switch and becomes evil out of jealousy. He goes along with Idea's plan to blow up every garden on the planet with missiles, which he regrets for all of 2 seconds, admitting that he grew up in Valam Garden, before shrugging that feeling off because the only thing he wants out of life is to blindly follow the sorceress. It's his dream to have a purpose in life, even if that purpose is serving a supervillain that wants to blow up your home. The hell kind of dream is that? Are you supposed to sympathize with this guy for being a moron? You've probably caught on by now, but the reason why Squall is impaled at the end of Disc 1 is because it's meant to be a cliffhanger. It's an exciting event that's supposed to push you into playing more to find out what happens. It's like the season finale of a TV show, except once you boot up Disc 2, the point is almost immediately written off because we've got 3 discs worth of story left, so of course Squall has to be in good health. Also, this is a game, not a show. You don't need to wait a year for the next season to drop. Each disc of the game isn't sold separately in episodic releases. You throw in the next disc right away and continue on. What's the point of placing such a pointless cliffhanger here? Once again, Nojima is writing twists just to shock the player without putting in any effort to tie these events with the story. His writing style works for manga and comic books, where each chapter doesn't need to have continuity in the overarching story. They can be one-off adventures, but this style doesn't work for long-form games like RPGs. And what's frustrating is that you wouldn't even need to put in that much effort to fix this issue. Idea doesn't need to throw an icicle at Squall. She could have knocked him on his ass so he blacks out, which she did earlier to Rinoa. There, problem solved. He's out cold, wakes up in an underground prison, and the story proceeds as usual. Or, have Squall be injured from the attack and reflect this in battle. His ATB charge is slower, his attacks are weaker. You could have incorporated some sort of combat penalty for the next chunk of the game until he recovers. Why set this event up just to immediately discard it without any consequence unless you have no respect for the player's intelligence? But it gets worse. You're interrogated in a maximum security prison. How maximum? The prison is a drill that burrows underground in the middle of the desert. I'm not sure what kind of criminals are housed here that necessitate sending the entire facility underground in case of a prison break. You'd think being stationed in the desert is good enough, but what's most baffling is how the facility gets power to drill in and out of the ground. Is it nuclear powered? And does the drill functionality exist to mine ore, extract oil? It's certainly a unique concept, but the game doesn't make any attempt to justify its design aside from it just looking cool. And it's so hilariously over-designed. Cells need to be transferred up and down several stories via a crane. Escorting prisoners the old-fashioned way with guards is too much effort. Better to spend $1 million in R&D and construction to build this crane mechanism. It's not like this facility is housing people with superpowers that need to remain in these cells at all times. These are normal people. And who cares if they escape their cells? The entire prison can be flooded with mechanical monsters at a moment's notice. Also, the party tries to escape by heading to the lower level, and there's no security measure in place to stop people from opening the door where the facility is submerged. Squall opens the door and the sand pressure blows it off its hinges. This is similar to the train fiasco from earlier, in that while this scenario makes for an entertaining mission, it doesn't make sense. It's difficult to take the story seriously when you're placed into these absurd situations. If you can suspend your disbelief, then yeah, the idea of escaping an enormous mobile prison sounds fun. But while I'm enjoying the game from a gameplay perspective, the story has completely lost me. Which is a shame, because these set-piece sequences are incredible. The prison burrows underground and Squall's shimmying across some railing inches away from certain death. Blending real-time gameplay with these FMVs still looks impressive 25 years later, and it helps me realize that I shouldn't take this game too seriously. Even though I could spend an hour complaining about this level, I have to step back and realize that I'm playing a fantasy adventure game. Having memorable sequences like this keeps the adventure exciting. If the game pushed the realism aspect too hard, these fantastical moments wouldn't exist. But there needs to be balance here, and the issue is that Final Fantasy VIII can't shake its Final Fantasy roots. It wants to be a science fiction game so bad, but the atmosphere and tone are brought down by fantasy elements like these Moombas. At no point during Disc 1 do you encounter any intelligent race aside from humans, but in Disc 2, you've got these bizarre creatures that appear out of nowhere, and while the cast isn't shocked by these races, the player is blindsided. It feels sudden, but to the characters, these are normal inhabitants of this world. They should have been introduced to the player in a way that doesn't feel jarring. This becomes a larger issue in Disc 3 when the game pushes further into the sci-fi realm, but we're a ways from that. First, we've got to stop the missiles from striking Balamb Garden. Naturally, the person best suited to lead the anti-missile launch team is Selphie because... I guess she's sad that her home garden is going to be obliterated. How exactly does that make her more qualified to lead the team that infiltrates the nuclear base than Quistis, or Irvin, or basically anyone else? The party splits up here, and I always like sending the chicks to the missile base just because I think it's funnier. None of the soldiers think that a trio of teenage girls walking around a missile base is strange. And now it's time for Nojima's favorite plot gimmick, convenience. It's mighty convenient that Selphie's team found a transport truck that just so happens to have 3 complete military uniforms that fit each party member, and the truck is automatically cleared for entrance into the missile base. And if that weren't convenient enough, they find a locked door inside, and Quistis reveals a keycard in her pocket that just so happens to be the exact one they need to enter. This whole segment is completely absurd. Every mission in this game is absurd, borderline impossible, and it makes for that kind of stupid entertainment where you're excited to see just how much more ridiculous these situations can get. The maintenance workers inside are too lazy to spend 10 minutes checking the circuit room as part of their routine maintenance, so they ask you to go in their place. And the guard takes your word for it and lets you inside. He doesn't think it's weird that you casually strolled into their base 2 minutes ago, unannounced, and are now conducting maintenance in the room that powers the entire facility instead of the usual crew. And by the way, the entire time this is happening, 70s porno music is playing in the background. After you shut the place down, which doesn't require any sort of security keycard or password, only 2 workers seem to care. The rest of the staff continues working. You fight 1 soldier and immediately decide that your cover's blown, even though there are no security cameras. Everyone rips off their uniform and runs to the self-destruct room. I have no idea why a missile base has a self-destruct system. Seems like this is the last place on Earth where you'd want to install explosives. And before you escape, this dying guard takes pity on you because you want to save the world and protect your friends. So he gives you the password to the missile control panel 2 feet away. It just so happens that this guy, who knows the code, is lying injured right by the control panel, and willingly gives you the code because he's the only person in the entire facility that has sympathy for you. Why? Why can't Selphie just find a keycard off a body and use that to access the panel? Keep it simple. Why does everything need to be so contrived? Of course you gotta fight a boss before you leave, and the girls are so overpowered from doing nothing that they blow up a tank by hitting it with their nunchucks and whips a few times. And even though the missile launchers explode just a few feet away from them, they apparently came up with a last-second plan of hiding inside the destroyed tank, which somehow protects them from an enormous nuclear blast, despite the fact that they easily caused the tank to self-destruct by whacking it with a whip. We'll catch up with the girls later, because for now we've gotta check in on the other team. The guys took on the much more dangerous mission, telling Sid that they failed to assassinate the sorceress. They hop aboard a train that conveniently drops them off on Balamb's doorstep, but not before you get this fun little scene. I like that the game has a sense of humor. Final Fantasy games during this era were a lot more lighthearted than you remember, something that modern Final Fantasies are missing out on. This is a great sequence. You get these FMVs showing the missiles heading your way, and the track that plays here does an excellent job of maintaining that sense of tension. You explore the basement levels of the garden and the power goes out, which creates this awesome scene where the elevator collapses above you, missing Irvin by inches. Plus the lights flicker as the emergency generator kicks in. I love the attention to detail here. It plays like an action movie. Squall climbs this ladder which comes off its hinges and sends him crashing through the glass into the control room. I don't even care that he lands exactly where he needs to be, just because watching this play out is so enjoyable. This pair of bosses gave me a lot of trouble when I first played the game, but when each attack of Squall's Limit Break deals enough damage on its own to kill the boss, there's no real challenge here. Not that I mind, like I said, destroying every single boss in this game with a few button taps is more satisfying than it sounds. It lets you race through the game at breakneck speed. I can stomach very few RPGs that are over 50 hours long these days, so being able to complete one in less than 20 is much more appealing. I get that this won't appeal to everyone, but as someone that just wants to enjoy watching this stupid story unfold, not having to grind or even encounter random enemies makes the experience more enjoyable. More of that Nojima convenience coming through. Moments before the missile strike, you just so happen to be right where you need to be to activate the garden's flying mechanism, which lets the garden slip past the missiles by just a few feet as it steers into the ocean. See what I mean by needing to just accept this ridiculousness to enjoy it? If you bust out some popcorn and enjoy the ride, it can be the most entertaining story in the series. If you try to make sense of these sci-fi elements and treat the story with respect, the game fails in a catastrophic way. Remember, the radio tower was repaired in the beginning of the game, but apparently the signal is still too weak to accommodate radio communication. There also exist HD cables buried underground to facilitate communication, but most of those are damaged from monster attacks, somehow. There's an excuse around every corner to stop this world from engaging in long-distance communication, but hey, computers and the internet still exist in this universe. Squall could have emailed Sid that missiles were headed his way. That way Sid or Norg could activate the garden's flying mechanism to steer clear of the incoming strike. Technology exists to propel 1,000-ton structures around the planet, but two-way long-distance communication is still difficult? I'm expected to believe this? Also, Sid and Norg collaborated to build this garden. They both know about its flying functionality. They paid to have it installed. This isn't something you spend millions on and forget about. Why didn't they use or maintain the panel that controls this feature during the past decade? Why doesn't Sid know how to pilot the garden? You made a flying military fortress and kept it grounded for a decade, so why even make it capable of flight? Just in case of emergency? Also, nice coincidence how Galbadia Garden activates their flight module at around the same time. Once you confront Norg, who goes down in a few hits of course, he blurts out that the sorceress is Sid's wife. The phrasing here feels unnatural and forced. He could have just said Sid and Edea are conspiring to take control of the garden, but he felt compelled to elaborate to the party that the two are married. When you confront Sid about this, he's unbelievably nonchalant, like it's a well-known fact. And to make matters worse, he admits that he married Edea knowing she was a sorceress, and despite that, the two think it's a good idea to start a military program to raise students into killing machines specifically trained to kill sorceresses. And when Sid raises this concern to Edea, explaining how idiotic of an idea this is, she just laughs and says that'll never happen. Talking to Sid here is a waste of time, he just creates more questions. The garden crashes into a fishing town, giving you this nice cutscene where this old guy needs to choose between reeling in the first fish that's bitten all day, or running from 1,000 tons of steel. And because everyone is always at the right place and time, the villagers are somehow knowledgeable about the garden's hover system, and they love fixing things, so they offer to repair the garden and teach you how to pilot it. And the coincidences just keep rolling. Galbadia attacks looking for Elone, and they show up to the one place on the planet that Balam Garden crashed into. The mayor's wife, Flo...
Excuse me, Flo?
tells you to deal with them because the village is run by hippies. They don't believe in violence. The tank from the missile base survived the nuclear blast, was brought all the way out to this island, and had a hydraulic propulsion system installed that allows it to soar through the air and land inches away from the party. When you destroy it for good, look who comes crawling out. You couldn't think of a better way to reunite the party? Forget it, I'm not gonna harp on this point, let's just call it lazy writing and move on. The game switches to a more lighthearted segment to give you a breather from all that action. Irvin wants to sleep with Selphie, so he encourages her to host a concert to lift everyone's spirits and get on our good side. Quistis claims she can't play an instrument, but she plays the bass like a pro. And because Irvin has your back, he hooks you up with a Playboy magazine so you can get it on with Renoa. I love the animations in this game. Even though the camera work is static for the most part, there's still a great sense of movement in these scenes thanks to the animations. The game's presentation and localization is such a monumental improvement over Final Fantasy VII, which might be why I prefer this cast. I don't understand a word of Japanese, so I can't speak to the accuracy of this English localization, but I couldn't care less if it's accurate or not. No amount of effort can fix this story or make it worse. At this point in the game, Irvin's limit break does most of the heavy lifting. If you don't upgrade your weapons, Squall's not going to get access to his most powerful limit breaks. Zell's limit is inefficient, it's strong but it takes forever to pull off, and most of the moves are single target. With Irvin, you can buy shotgun ammo and kill every target on the screen in one turn. Later on, you'll get even more powerful ammo for free and eclipse everyone in terms of how long it takes to kill bosses. Alright, so here's the infamous Orphanage plot twist. I'm sure this has been covered to death, so I'm gonna try to keep this short. Irvin casually mentions to the group how everyone in the party, excluding Rinoa, grew up in the same orphanage. They split up across the world and eventually forgot about each other, except for Irvin. What's the explanation? No one's sure, but Irvin's guess is that GFs have something to do with it. For whatever reason, junctioning GFs affects your memory and can cause you to randomly forget parts of your past. That's the entire 15-minute scene in a nutshell, then the party moves on with the plot. So why is this a problem? Well, for one, Selphie and Quistis immediately question Irvin as to why he didn't bring this up when he joined the team, to which Irvin responds, "'Cause you two seem to have forgotten," which isn't an answer. Why didn't you tell us that we grew up together? Oh, I didn't tell you because it sucked that I was the only one who remembered. Wow, that is a problem, Irvin. You know how you fix that? By telling everyone so they can remember. Why did you wait until just now to bring this up? Why not mention this at the start? That way the team knows not to rely on you to assassinate the sorceress. And speaking of the sorceress, Sid also ran the orphanage. How did Squall forget about Sid? Okay, he forgot about Edea, Irvin, and Selphie. They've been separated for a while, but he's lived under Sid's care at the garden for the past 10 years, alongside both Quistis and Zell. He grew up with these people and forgot about their history? And why did Sid keep his mouth shut? Why did he never once mention Edea in the past decade? To make it easier for these kids to kill her? Well, why the hell did he start the garden in the first damn place if he was gonna raise kids to kill his wife? What kind of insane plan is that? Does Sid not care that the kids he raised are losing their minds, and that he poured millions of dollars and a decade of effort into killing a single person? Why not spend that time and money in finding a way to save her instead? Also, how does this memory wipe from the GFs work exactly? Squall remembers that his sister left him, but he doesn't remember her name or face. In fact, the GF explanation is what makes this twist so painful. For some reason, Irvin is the only Seed member that resisted junctioning for so long out of paranoia of losing his memory, yet the moment he joins your team, he junctions without question. Also, the memory loss the GFs induce is apparently strong enough to make you forget huge chunks of your past, until you think about it for a moment and remember anyway. That's really the worst part, that the memory loss isn't permanent and you remember everything just by casually deciding to think about your past. That's all it takes. And why have this twist at all? What does this accomplish? So the characters remember that they grew up together and that the sorceress raised them. Okay, they decide that Edea needs to die anyway, and everyone decides to keep using GFs because they let them kill bosses in one hit, so what's the point? I get it, this twist tries to explain why characters behave the way they do. It explains why Irvin is infatuated with Selphie, why Zell and Squall share a rivalry with Cypher, why Quistis has conflicting feelings about Squall, why Squall feels hesitant about making friends. He lost his sister and doesn't want to experience that grief again. This twist tries to package all of these explanations into one box and tie it up with a neat ribbon. But it doesn't work. It's too forced, it's too convenient, and it's explained way too late in the story. Whether or not the scene was properly foreshadowed is irrelevant. The game drops hints along the way, but even if you somehow predicted this twist, the revelation doesn't impact the plot because your mission stays the same. Kill the sorceress and keep using GFs. The end of Disc 2 plays out like a big budget action movie, definitely a highlight of the game. Plus you get to listen to Uematsu's best work. He's a well-rounded composer, and he's at his best when he's creating high-energy tracks. But don't take my word for it. Take a listen to his work with the Black Mages. I got lucky with the drop you get for beating Cypher at the end of this disc. He's normally supposed to drop an item called Hero, which makes a party member invincible for a few seconds, but his rare drop is called Holy War, which is the same effect but it applies to the entire party. In a game where you already kill bosses before they take a single turn, I think it's hilarious that you can render yourself immortal, yet the villains still think they stand a chance against you. It's not like this is a power exclusive to the party either. Anyone can refine their Laguna playing card into 100 heroes and become God. Seems like every time characters stand around talking about someone's backstory, set to sad music, the story takes a beating. Edea explains how a sorceress from the future possessed her because she's looking for Alone, so she can go back further in time and possess an older sorceress, which for some reason will cause time and space to compress into a singular point and extinguish all life. Despite harping on every major plot point so far, I'm not even gonna bother trying to figure this one out for one simple reason: time travel is involved. When you're dealing with time travel stories, there are no rules. I think Back to the Future 2 handled time travel best by explaining time as a line that branches. You can't alter the future, you can just switch your course to an alternate timeline. When you look at the story from this perspective, you can't really kill Ultimecia across an infinite number of timelines. Edea got her powers from Ultimecia, who traveled back in time after she was mortally wounded by Squall, so to ensure that Ultimecia dies, Edea needs to create a garden and raise seeds. But what kickstarted this cycle? If Edea's idea for garden came from Squall telling her, then this is a bootstrap paradox, there's no origin point. And while we're on the subject, Ultimecia wants to compress time to avoid being killed by Seed, which will kill everyone across time except for her. Because this action threatens all life, Squall sees her as an enemy and decides she needs to die, which is precisely the reason why Ultimecia wants to compress time, thus creating another paradox. There's not much point diving into this further, it doesn't make sense, and the worst part is that all of this effort only affects one timeline. Remember the Back to the Future comparison? Squall going back in time to warn Edea causes the timeline to split, so any action made from this point onward only affects this branch of the timeline. I'm not saying this means the story is pointless, we didn't cover the love story part yet and it's by far the more engaging half of the narrative, but I can't take the time travel plot seriously. It works in a comedy like Back to the Future, and it works in a more lighthearted fantasy adventure like Chrono Trigger, because those stories aren't meant to be taken seriously. Games like Bioshock Infinite and Final Fantasy VIII want you to care about the fate of the world, but it's difficult to do so when traditional time travel tropes result in paradoxes. On a related note, Squall wants to save Rinoa by altering the past. Alone explains that this is impossible. She proves it firsthand through the numerous Laguna flashbacks, but Squall still doesn't believe her and spends most of Disc 3 looking for her. Alone is the source of another headache. You see, a scientist created a machine that copied Alone's brainwaves, and in the future this machine is so advanced that you can use it to possess people in the past, rather than just observing the past through another's eyes. Ultimecia uses this to possess sorceresses. Couple of questions here. 1. How did Ultimecia get her hands on this machine, and how did she learn about it? Are they mass-produced and advertised? Why is such a powerful machine not protected by some sort of biometric security system, and locked up in a maximum security facility to prevent abuse? This thing lets you time travel. 2. How did she learn of Edea so she could possess her? Alone's power only works by allowing her to see the past of people she personally knows. How could Ultimecia possess Edea if she never met her? Unless she already knows that she needs to possess her. And if that's the case, then this is yet another paradox. 3. The machine only allows Ultimecia to possess sorceresses, which is unrelated to Alone's power, yet the machine is modeled after Alone's brainwaves, so what happened to cause the functionality of this machine to change? I could go on, but the point is that this junction machine plot point wasn't fleshed out very well, which is surprising considering it's the reason why Ultimecia is even a threat in the first place. You're hit with some more Laguna flashbacks in Disc 3, and I haven't been covering these because there's not much to say. They exist to flesh out the history of the world, and these Laguna scenes are some of the most memorable parts of the game. Laguna has a nose for adventure, and that gets him into trouble more often than not. Even this segment where he's filming a movie, which is pure filler, manages to stay entertaining because it's brief. The lighthearted tone is a welcome reprieve from the drama unfolding in present day, and you've got a fun minigame where you're sparring with a dragon. Once that's done, you encounter another undead boss. Throwing an elixir at it will end the fight in 5 seconds, but I'd rather end the fight in 10 seconds by killing it properly with limit breaks. You'll notice how we've broken the game in stages, relying on Squall's limit at first, then refining triples, refining curagas, getting encounter none, but for the end game, we're gonna make ammo. Once Ifrit reaches level 10, you can learn the ammo refine ability, and with items you get from playing the story, nothing special you need to go out of your way to grab. You can refine endgame ammo that lets you melt the remaining bosses. AP ammo lets you hit the damage cap, and demolition ammo targets every enemy on the screen at once, and you can make 300 rounds for free. These are items you get from a story boss in Disc 2. Going out of your way to get Squall's Lionheart weapon isn't worth the hassle, when Irvin can handle every story boss in the game without issue, and if you want to fight the optional bosses like Omega Weapon, you can fish for Selphie's limit break called The End, which will instantly end the fight. Elone is in a space station. She was so desperate to see Laguna again, and Laguna just so happened to be in space at the time when she arrived in Estar, that she followed after him. I guess it's easier to enter outer space than return to the surface, because when the crew arrives in Estar and demands to see Elone, the scientists don't send her back down. They instead pack you into capsules and shoot you into space, including Rinoa, who's in a coma. I'm sure she can brace herself from the G's generated by her capsule smacking through these grids and suddenly coming to a halt. This space station segment highlights the forgotten art of fixed camera angles. Fixed cameras fell out of favor after the turn of the century, and I will never understand why. For whatever reason, players want to wrestle with the camera when playing most modern 3D games. The beauty of fixed perspectives is you can design levels to force the player to look at exactly what you want him to look at. Or in the case of a horror game, you can use the angles to hide enemies and create suspense. When you can control the camera in a 3D horror game, you can see what the characters can't, which eliminates that fear of the unknown, so you need to rely more on jump scares to startle the player. In Final Fantasy VIII, the fixed camera is used to frame each screen without cutting away to a dedicated cutscene, so you get this seamless experience of exploring a level before watching a boss suddenly descend from the sky. And the scene uses this low-angle view to make your characters appear weaker before their foe. In the space station, you get this great aerial view of Rinoa, which lets you see the station rotating through the glass floor. This upside-down hallway shows you that there is no upside down or right side up. It's the artificial gravity keeping everyone on the floor. The level designers did a great job selling you on walking through a space station thanks to the fixed angles. As luck would have it, Ultimecia has been possessing Rinoa for the entirety of Disc 3, and was counting on being launched into space so she could unshackle Adel and continue her plan. And of course, nothing is secure in this universe. You slam your fist on some buttons to shut off the power to a nuclear base, you smack a control panel to activate Balamgarden's flight function, and Rinoa presses a button and releases the lock from Adel's space prison. No security code needed. How did Ultimecia know to remain dormant in Rinoa, expecting to be blasted into space so she could continue her master plan? I have no clue, but instead of trying to make sense of that, I'm more curious about why nobody thought to re-enable Adel's lock after Rinoa left the station. If she could easily unlock the seal with a button press, why can't someone just as easily press a button to relock it? Also, Elone is right there, and the party is in space and stands no chance against Ultimecia at this point. There's no way for backup to arrive in time to stop her. Even possessing a supposedly weak sorceress, she's strong enough to blast Squall away just by touching him. Why does the rest of this game even exist when Ultimecia was looking for Elone all this time, and could just use her right now? Anyway, you get this cool sequence where you see bits of the story from Rinoa's perspective. I love this animation where she forces Irvin back into the truck to head back to the prison. The romance between Squall and Rinoa is pretty atypical by this series standards, which makes it more interesting. Squall comes across as disinterested, but his inner monologues reveal that he does care about people, he's just afraid of expressing himself. You see him change over the course of the journey, and it's cool to see this introverted guy gradually open up to everyone. You also experienced a moment Rinoa became possessed by Ultimecia, which gives you this unsettling scene where Ultimecia kicks you out of the dream. Then, without any sort of tether or propulsion system, Squall dives out into deep space to catch Rinoa. Even though steering through space is impossible, he manages to catch Rinoa, but that's the most believable part of this section, because moments later, minutes away from running out of oxygen, a drifting spaceship floats by within arm's reach, the latch is unlocked, the ship has functioning oxygen and gravity generators, and it has enough fuel to return to the surface, despite being derelict for 17 years. This is the Ragnarok, and several of them were used to carry Adol's tomb into space 17 years ago. One of the ships was presumably attacked by aliens that killed everyone on board, and has been floating for almost 20 years without anyone making any effort to recover the ship. Of all the moments of insane, impossible luck that happen in this game, this tops the chart. It tops the entire series. Oh, and radio communication is possible again. It was partially cleared when the communication tower was reactivated, but now they're clear enough to communicate to spaceships. This is because Adol's tomb was the source of the interference. The technology used to seal her powers also jams the airwaves if the tomb is sent into space. Only in space. When the tomb was on the surface, the airwaves were fine. Estar is advanced enough to build this futuristic city that can cloak itself, but they can't figure out how to seal Adol without jamming the radio channels. This is convenient because it allows Estar's air traffic control to contact Squall the moment he enters the cockpit, and they guide him back to the surface. Why they decided to suddenly radio the Ragnarok after 17 years of radio silence the exact moment the airwaves were cleared? I don't know. They expected someone to be alive after 17 years without contact. When you land, Estar takes Rinoa away, but they let you keep their $10 billion over-designed spaceship. The design is cool, but does it need to look like a dragon, have dual Gatling guns, a laser cannon, and articulate claws that can latch onto any surface? No other country has a space program, and we have no reason to believe Estar has made contact with alien races from other planets, so why even create a spaceship with all this firepower? It was used to carry heavy machinery into space, not fight wars. Also, Selphie grasps the controls in a few seconds and is able to utilize every function of the spaceship without referencing a manual. Squall regrets giving up Rinoa without a fight after risking his life to save her. I say regret, but in reality he needs to be convinced by Quistis. Even for Squall, I find this hard to believe, but I guess the devs went through all this effort designing the FMV that the logo was based off of, and they didn't know where else to include it. Here's the plan to end all plans. You're gonna allow Ultimecia to do what she wants, compress time, but you're gonna interrupt that process, which will somehow allow the team to time travel into the future to the precise time and location where Ultimecia exists. How does Odin know this will happen? He doesn't, and I don't see any magic ball in his room, so I doubt he can see into the future. It's a theory. Time compression itself is a theory. Nobody's done it before, so Ultimecia has no reason to believe it'll work. How does she know to use time compression magic in the first place? Who developed this magic? Also, you apparently need to interrupt this process at a precise moment. Odin doesn't know what the signal is, but Elone will feel it, and that's her cue to send the team into the future. Again, nobody should understand how any of this works. Now you can travel the world with your new spaceship and complete every side quest. You could partially explore the world when Balam Garden gained its flight capability, but the Ragnarok gives you full access. The snag here is that most of the world is empty. Square designed this huge map, and there's not really a good reason to explore most of it. You can land on islands that are packed with invisible draw points, which contain the best spells in the game. None of this matters because you could get all the triples you needed 12 hours ago. And most of the side quests are terrible. The rewards aren't worth your time, and even if you're not doing them for the rewards, the quests themselves aren't designed well. If you waste your time heading out to Shumi Village, the Elder says he wants to give you a reward for talking to him, but first he wants you to help the sculptor finish his statue of Laguna, which means running around looking for rocks, and the reward is a Phoenix Pinion. Big deal. Getting a game over in this game is next to impossible. If you go to these dome-shaped forests, you can catch chocobos. Completely pointless once you've got the Ragnarok. If you befriend the chocobo from every forest in the game, your reward is a triple triad card, so definitely worth wasting your time there. This is also where the Pocket Station minigame comes into play. This was some Tamagotchi memory card thing that never left Japan, probably for a good reason. I never knew anyone that imported one of these, and I'm surprised this functionality was even localized for the Western release instead of just being removed. But the best side content can be found in these optional dungeons where you fight and recruit new GFs. This one where you get Odin is on a clock, and the timer is insanely generous considering there's only one puzzle to solve here. And Odin dies in one hit, but the theming for this dungeon is fantastic. I love this blend between sci-fi and medieval fantasy. You've got these holographic railings that glow along the staircases, this levitating stone, and these floating numbers that appear above this flame. Plus it's set to this dreamlike piano tune that lends a really creepy atmosphere to the dungeon. Uematsu outdid himself with this game. This is probably his best work from the PS1 era, and unfortunately, I can't play most of it because Square loves to copyright claim music from certain composers like Uematsu and Shimomura. Probably because they want you to buy their overpriced soundtracks from their store, where they can charge you $10 shipping for a disc. But what really drives most of the songs on this soundtrack are the percussion tracks. Considering you're playing as soldiers, it makes sense that most of the songs have this military flair to them. It lends a cohesive theme to the soundtrack, and these more intense songs are a nice contrast to the softer piano tunes that complement the romantic half of the storyline. And even though the soundtrack is consistently great, Disc 4 cements its status as one of the best in the series. The theme for the castle is this Baroque masterpiece, and the final boss gauntlet consists of 3 back-to-back killer songs, culminating in my favorite final boss theme. But there are still a few bosses to get through before entering the final dungeon. Irvin single-handedly solos every boss at the end of Disc 3, and Disc 4 for that matter. Not sure why every Cypher fight needs to play out the same. If you have Odin here, Cypher kills him, and if you're a high enough level, you can draw Aura, yet during the fight itself, he's as much of a pushover as he was in Disc 1. This is assuming you don't just kill him in one turn with your limit break, but for someone who has a prominent spot on the cover and is built up to be your rival, he never puts up a serious fight. I think this would be a better fight if it was a one-on-one duel, Squall versus Cypher like the FMV at the beginning of the game. In fact, this FMV should have played here instead of during the intro. During development, the director said Squall doesn't have the scar at the beginning of the game, it happens later. There should have been this lingering mystery wondering when and how Squall gets the scar, instead of having it be the first event that happens. This whole rivalry with Cypher feels so pathetic. It could have been handled so much better. And that's the end of Disc 3. It's pretty short and doesn't have the awesome ending sequence that Disc 2 had. Disc 4 leads with another anticlimactic boss. This is supposedly the strongest sorceress to have ever lived, and she junctions Rinoa to herself for that extra oomph, but she dies minutes after being freed. For a character who's built up to be a serious threat, it's almost laughable how you kill her the second she steps out of her tomb. She can't even step outside for air. You deal with her immediately. This is more of that top-tier Nojima storytelling. The game loves telling you how strong this character is, but you don't ever see how strong she is. You spend 5 flashbacks playing as Laguna, who's in the midst of Adel's reign and is responsible for sealing her away, but you never see her cast a single spell or do anything malicious. This is all relayed through dialogue. It's a total waste of a villain. I think what happened here is that the script saw several revisions, and Adel was possibly the main villain at one point. Once Ultimecia was brought into the picture, Adel's role had to be marginalized. The game can't spend too much time focusing on her, because the true villain is Ultimecia, which was a huge mistake. Ultimecia doesn't need to be a part of this storyline. Adel is already a big enough threat. She started a major war, and was supposedly so powerful that she couldn't be killed. She needed to be shot into space. You've already got a villain that wants to rule the world. Just give her the ability to mind control other sorceresses and you're good to go. Leave the time travel out of it, and focus on developing the rivalry with Cypher and showing why Adel is such a threat. That would have made for a more engaging narrative than this nebulous sorceress from the future that wants to merge every point in time. And of course the plan works and the team slingshots into the future, but not before fighting a dozen generic sorceresses that were also pulled into the wormhole. This is one of the more visually interesting fights in the game because the background changes whenever a new sorceress spawns, and it's all done in real time. Square saved most of their visual tricks for the final disc. After the fight ends, you wind up back at the orphanage, where the scene seamlessly blends into the same orphanage but in the future where Ultimecia exists, and her Dracula castle is chained to the cliffs. This is the best dungeon in the series, both aesthetically and mechanically. These pre-rendered backgrounds are timeless, yet another lost art of game design that's been replaced by 3D environments. You needed to pay attention to details in the level design to progress. Objects like ladders weren't immediately obvious. You didn't always know what you could or couldn't climb, which meant your eyes were always on the hunt for small details. You could appreciate the level design more because you were forced to examine it. With modern games, developers have zero respect for the player. They'll paint every ladder, every ledge, put glowing button prompts on the screen just to make sure you don't get stuck if you're not paying attention. Final Fantasy VII Remake is the biggest offender of this, with glowing arrows directing you down a hallway. Just look at the minimap. Where else are you gonna go? Because there's no map in Final Fantasy VIII, the designers needed to ensure each screen felt distinct. It's easy to navigate this dungeon despite its length, because you can name each room: the fountain room, the huge staircase, the clock tower. Plus, there are various traps and secrets hidden throughout, and to incentivize this exploration, the game sends you into the dungeon with all of your abilities stripped, even your ability to save. You need to re-enable them by killing bosses, and while some can be found just by wandering around, others require some puzzle solving. Your party is also split into teams, requiring both groups to work together to fully explore the dungeon. For all the effort that went into designing this castle, it's remarkable that the game doesn't force you to explore all of it. You don't need to fight any of these bosses. Even the Sphinx guarding the central staircase, which looks mandatory, can be skipped. You can fight as many as you like to gain your powers back, and when you're ready, you can choose when to tackle the final boss. To beat Ultimecia, all you need is the ability to use items and limit breaks. She summons 3 characters at random at the start of the fight, which you can manipulate by saving outside the castle, resetting the game, then drawing from this draw point 3 times before exiting the clock tower. This will give you a specific formation for a party that speedrunners like to use for this fight. But there's an even faster method that involves paying attention to Squall's random movements during this FMV. You input those movements into a program, which will spit out the number of times you need to draw. Now, I'm not a speedrunner. I tested my luck the good old-fashioned way and got Irvin on my first attempt, who is really all you need to destroy Ultimecia. I like how she doesn't waste your time giving you her life story. She taunts you for a few lines, then jumps straight into the fight. To give you an idea as to how easy this fight is, I don't take a single point of damage. Her first phase dies to demolition ammo spam, but we need the timer during the limit break to be a bit longer, so to raise the crisis level we use an aura stone. Don't need to unlock magic from the bosses, if you get items that can cast the spells you need. Plus we put that holy war that Cypher dropped earlier to good use. The transition between phases 2 and 3 would ordinarily kill the team at these health levels. At this point the fight is over, she can't touch the team, and you're hitting the damage cap despite barely interacting with the game. Never upgraded any weapons, had encounter none enabled the whole time, didn't spend hours drawing magic. Anyone can do this without putting forth any effort. With that in mind, is this a good fight? Are any of the bosses in this game rewarding? I won't try to convince you one way or the other because I'm not sure myself. Challenge is an important part of all video games. You set your own standards for what you consider to be an acceptable level of challenge, and with that in mind, I don't like games that are so easy that they don't require much thought to complete. And not much effort is required to trivialize this game. You can maintain that low difficulty level from start to finish with just a little bit of foresight. On a blind playthrough, sure, you're not going to crack the experience wide open, but even new players will find things like encounter none and the ability to refine cards into items and spells, which is enough to dramatically lower the difficulty level. It's too easy to become too overpowered. When viewed in the grand scope of the series, this makes Final Fantasy VIII an outlier. This isn't a series famed for its difficulty, but no other entry rewards you for putting in the bare minimum effort by making the game easier. With that in mind, this is one of the rare exceptions I've made where the easier difficulty is a positive. I've already said how the low level of challenge makes speedruns of this game more enticing, but beyond that, you still need to manipulate the game into staying easy. This isn't a gimme. You need to know which GFs to acquire, which abilities to learn, which items to refine into spells, who to junction them to. Much in the same way that gambits work in Final Fantasy XII, most of the depth in Final Fantasy VIII's combat comes from battle preparations rather than the fights themselves. You're still engaging with the game's systems and finding a solution to each boss. And while a traditional RPG would have your success be dictated by reactive play, Final Fantasy VIII rewards proactive play. Put simply, you've made the decisions that will determine the outcome of the battle before you've even started it. Once you're in the fight, it's just a matter of triggering your limit break to deliver the payoff. This is just a long-winded way to say that breaking the game is fun. Not every game needs to be an endurance match. Sometimes you just want a more casual experience. There's really nothing more to it than that. Even though Ultimecia is dead, she can't die until she passes her powers to someone else. Seeing as there are no suitable recipients in her current timeline, she follows Squall back in time to when he was a child, and passes her powers onto Edea. We're gonna get into this in a little bit, but the game does a poor job of explaining how sorceresses work. They aren't immortal, they have a normal human lifespan, but in order to die peacefully, they need to pass their powers onto a successor. The game doesn't show what happens if a sorceress doesn't pass on her powers, if they continue living like the Unsent in Final Fantasy X, if they haunt people. The explanation isn't clear. In any case, it's profoundly idiotic that Squall allows Ultimecia to pass her powers onto Edea, knowing full well that this event is what's keeping this endless loop going. It's also insane that young Squall meets his future self, but forgets because of the GF-induced memory loss. Edea is also very accepting of the fact that Squall is a time traveler. Funny how she never brings this event up when you speak to her at the Orphanage during the beginning of Disc 3. The developers knew that this story was half-assed and confusing, so to help clear things up just a hair, Square released a book only in Japan called Final Fantasy VIII Ultimania. Turns out that Nojima, in his finite wisdom, forgot to explain the origin of sorceresses. There are maybe 2 lines of optional dialogue in the game that talk about this god called Hein, but the game doesn't outright tell you how sorceresses came to be. The book explains that this god gave humanity half of his body and power, and when the time came for humanity to rely on this power, they found that they were duped. So people went searching for God and couldn't find him because he hid his power within women. Why? How? Never explained, but this is as close to an origin story for the sorceresses that we're ever gonna get. Also explained in the book is why the crowd didn't scatter in a panic when Edea killed their president right in front of them. Apparently, Ultimecia cast some sort of charm magic on the citizens to stir them into a frenzy. If Ultimecia can manipulate Cypher and charm a crowd of hundreds, what's so difficult about charming the main party? When everyone was imprisoned, she should have just cast whatever this spell was on the main party instead of relying on Cypher to torture Squall. Instead, she sends missiles to Balam. Missiles, by the way, that would have killed Alone and ruined Ultimecia's plan if Squall didn't break out of the prison and steer Balam Garden out of danger. I don't want to beat this dead horse further, even though I could spend another hour complaining about Ultimecia, because this is the end of the game and you get the point by now. I've already explained why I like the gameplay, but did I enjoy the story of this game? Surprisingly, yes, and for one simple reason. It's filled with so many plot holes and contrivances that it makes discussions about the story interesting. That's another reason why I made this video, to analyze this story and nitpick the little details, finding new plot holes I missed before, questioning the actions of almost every character. The entire script is packed to the brim with Deus Ex Machinas, impossible luck, and rampant stupidity. So much that it shoots past so bad it's good and becomes a 50-car pileup that you can't look away from. Characters' motives are flimsy, the villains are incompetent, the technology is poorly explained, major plot revelations don't impact the narrative, every single story beat falls flat. This is such an incomprehensible mess that it's honestly shocking that Nojima continues to be commissioned by Square Enix to this day. That said, this is perhaps his best work, which happened by complete accident. In his quest to write an engaging narrative, he penned a draft so bad that it accomplished what he sought to do, make an entertaining story, but for all the wrong reasons. It's not often you come across a story told so poorly that you can't help but become invested in finding out just how loosely each thread is tied together by the end. Don't get me wrong, I'll take a well-written story over this any day of the week, but if I had to choose between your typical JRPG storyline that's completely forgettable and this disaster, I'll take the disaster every single time. I find that media, good or bad, so long as it elicits a strong response from you, is worth your time. Better to hate something and remember it forever, than waste your time on mediocrity. If you can't write a good story, first of all, find a different job, but if you have no other choice, better to make it deliberately awful. Nojima somewhat learned his lesson in recent years by writing Stranger of Paradise. At one point, Final Fantasy VIII was my favorite game. Having completed the game for this video, it's clear that my love for the game has waned. Other Final Fantasy games like Tactics and 12, I've come to love more with each playthrough. They present rich worlds with well-developed characters, plus the combat systems are extremely flexible. With 8, I'm not sure how many more playthroughs I have left in me. Breaking the game is fun, but how many times can you play through the game one-shotting every boss before you get bored? Sure, you can try out different challenge runs, but then you're ignoring the main draw of the combat system to begin with. If I wanted to play a traditional battle system, I'd much rather play other Final Fantasies like the DS version of 4, where I don't need to gimp myself to get some challenge from the experience. The enduring charm of Final Fantasy VIII comes from the lack of balancing, but that can only carry it so far. The music is timeless. It represents Uematsu at his peak. The art direction is great. The FMVs still impress me over 20 years later. Triple Triad is fun, if not imbalanced. The story is nonsense, but it's the kind of disaster that you can't help but find yourself fascinated with. The game is paced well. I beat it in around 17 hours during this playthrough, which is just about the perfect length for a JRPG. Not needing to level up to grow your characters is a great concept. The game just didn't get the balancing right. The director of Final Fantasy VIII spoke about the changes he'd make in a potential remake, and honestly, the game does need a complete combat overhaul. Fixing the combat, however, means that the remake wouldn't be Final Fantasy VIII. This game is remembered for its sheer brokenness, not for being a balanced game. If you strip that identity away, you're not remaking Final Fantasy VIII, you're reimagining it. Maybe not such a bad thing when you consider Final Fantasy VII Remake's combat system was a massive improvement over the original games, even if the story is undoubtedly worse. That's not really going to be an issue with Final Fantasy VIII. I can't imagine any scenario in which this story can be ruined. But more than anything, I'm fatigued from this era of endless remakes and sequels. What makes games like Final Fantasy VIII an oddity, even to this day, is that it's unique. I find that with each passing year, I'm gravitating more towards games that offer experiences you can't get elsewhere, for better and worse. When you flood the market with remakes and sequels, you're removing some charm from the original games. I'm no longer asking whether or not I want to replay Final Fantasy VII, I need to decide if I want to play the original, the remake, or one of the many side games. Nothing wrong with having more choices, the original game will always exist, but very rarely will a remake make the same impact that the original game made. When you sell familiar experiences to people, the magic of discovery is gone. Think about the first time you played a modern FromSoft game like Dark Souls or Bloodborne. That first playthrough will always stick with you because of how fresh the experience was. No sequel or remake will ever capture the magic of that first run, because they reuse elements that you're already familiar with. That sense of exploration and discovery is neutered because you already understand how these games should be played, and they all share a similar structure. The same applies to games like Final Fantasy VII. If you already understand the basic story beats of the original game, then the plot in the remake won't deliver the same punch you felt from playing the original the first time. A handful of twists are included to desperately catch your attention. Taking the combat system of Final Fantasy VII Remake and making an entirely new IP instead would have resulted in a much better game, one that tried to be its own thing rather than retreading old ground. A story that would have felt fresh without needing to resort to contrived twists to surprise older fans. But I get it, people want more of what they love. It's hard to fault developers for giving fans what they want. It makes sense. Create products that are in the highest demand. If a Final Fantasy VIII remake ever materializes, of course I'd play it. I already admitted at the very start that I'm a total hypocrite when it comes to this game. I'm very critical of Square's modern output, but the one aspect they've been consistent with is combat. For all the flaws with Square's output post Final Fantasy XII, the combat systems have remained a highlight. I have no doubt that a remake of Final Fantasy VIII would have much more compelling combat than the original, but the original will always possess this timeless charm. I can't think of many RPGs where you can crack the combat wide open in the first few hours. For all the complaining I've done, hopefully it's easy to see why I'm passionate about this game. People don't drone on about a game for this long unless they have a strong feeling about it. And if you think I've been overly critical, it's only because I enjoy nitpicking the games I care about. My intent isn't to convince you to steer clear of this game, quite the opposite. Final Fantasy VIII is a peculiar game, and it's one where poking at it to see it completely unravel is half the fun. There's nothing else like it in this series. It may not be my favorite game of all time anymore, but it's certainly an unforgettable experience that I was glad to revisit.